Hello and welcome to the Nordic Mythology Podcast. I'm Daniel Farron, co-owner of the company Horns of Odin, and I'm joined, as always, by Dr. Mathias Nordvik.
Hello.
And this week, this is a bonus episode for our Patreon fans, where we're going to look at, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, Ynglinga Saga. How was that?
Bad.
I figured so. I figured it would be.
It's Ynglinga Saga.
You know, after I said it, I thought maybe the Y wasn't prominently pronounced.
Yeah. It's sort of like an I sound in Icelandic. The other Scandinavians would say Ynglinga Saga. So yeah.
As long as you don't say Ynglinga.
I guess so.
Well, it's learning.
It is, yes.
So, how are you before we jump into Silent Saga?
I'm good. I'm busy. Teaching. Trying to take a little break from the hustling and busting of life while still doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I just come back from New Mexico. It was wonderful. A couple of days in the sun. Down there, they still have, 77 degrees and like hot, scorching sun and rattlesnakes, exactly how I like it. So, yeah.
You get a couple of days off, and when you're driving back, you get some annoying British guy texting you saying, "Were you doing a podcast tonight?"
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I'm that annoying British man. So,
that's how it goes.
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, this is one of the Storytime episodes. So I mean, should we just jump straight into it? You want to start off telling us a little bit about it, and then you can tell us the story?
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so Ynglinga Saga is a very interesting saga for me. I did use it for my research back in the day when I was doing my PhD. I even wrote a big portion of my MA thesis on this saga, and it's one of the sagas of the collection called Heimskringla. So that is sort of like weirdly translated to the orb of the world.
Okay.
It sounds like some kind of wizardry. It's not, though. It just means sort of like the circumference of the world. Heimskringla means the world's sort of like circumference. So
Right.
it's the reason that this collection of sagas are called that is because that's what the first leaf of the manuscript that we have, the oldest manuscript that we have, says. Kringla heimsins skapad, or something like that. The circumference of the world, the orb of the world is created in this manner. And then we have Ynglinga Saga that tells us exactly how it's created. Ynglinga Saga and the other sagas in Heimskringla are the sagas of the Norwegian kings. So they detail the genealogy, the supposed genealogy of the kings of Norway, and to an extent also of Sweden, because that's where we begin with the Ynglinga Saga. That's where the earliest royal house that supposedly ends up ruling Norway and Sweden is from. And it is possible that it is Snorri Sturluson himself who has written this saga, and possibly also the rest of these sagas of the Norwegian kings in Heimskringla.
So these real life stories mixed with a little bit of mythology in there, or are they completely fabricated?
So that's the $1 million question when it comes to sagas.
Okay, it's just with you mentioning them kind of being the Norwegian kings. I'm assuming that this set kind of on Earth with real life people rather than being set kind of in a whole different world that we, obviously I guess we can assume
Yeah.
isn't real.
Yeah, no, this is set on Earth. It is happening in Scandinavia and elsewhere in Europe. A little bit of even the Far East, because that's actually where we start with this saga.
Okay.
It's really interesting that so the reason that people think that Snorri Sturluson might have written this saga and the other sagas in Heimskringla is that this at one point in the saga about Snorri and his family, Sturlunga Saga, it is said that he sits down and he writes a bunch of sagas. Now, it's not 100% clear what he's writing here, or if these sagas that he's writing are different from his Edda, which is the main source, or one of the main sources to Nordic mythology. But he does that according to this saga, and that has later on been interpreted that he wrote Heimskringla because the content of Ynglinga Saga is similar to the content of Edda when it comes to mythology. He describes the author describes a lot of similar things.
Okay.
In terms of the mythology, which we will get into. But to be honest about this, actually, I think it was in the 1600s, there was a Norwegian who translated Heimskringla into the Norwegian at the time. I think it was in the 1600s, and he attributed the collection to Snorri Sturluson, and the Icelandic scholars at the time confounded by that. They were like, "What? Why?
Okay.
We didn't know that. Where did you know this from?" So it is actually it's debated whether or not it is. If you look this up at Wikipedia or any other place on the internet, and most as well, it will say that it was Snorri Sturluson. But
yeah, so that's what I was going to ask. Is kind of when I did a little bit of quick googling before. Is it part of the Prose Edda, or is it a separate?
It is. This is its own separate thing. This is considered a different genre altogether of literature.
Okay.
The Prose Edda is not considered a saga. This is considered mythology, a myth, and these are modern distinctions that scholars use now. These are distinctions that Snorri Sturluson would have used himself. Actually, he didn't really see the difference between those extended sagas about kings or some dude taking land in Iceland, and then the stories about the Nordic gods. And this, if you can read the old language in Snorri Sturluson's Edda, you can see that he uses different words for the stories that he tells. Like he says, this saga is about this and that, and then he goes on from there. He also sometimes says this frásögn, which could be translated to folk tale or something like that. So like he just mixes all of this up as he goes along.
So but this might sound a little bit silly. So what classes as a saga then? I always just assumed a saga was a story, but I'm guessing it's a little bit deeper than that.
Oh, dude, you have no idea how much we can nitpick in this as scholars.
Okay.
So in order to distinguish roughly between these types of stories, we have settled on defining a saga as an extended narrative about humans.
Okay.
Yeah.
So even though the gods don't, I guess we always assume they have human forms.
Well, that's the next thing.
Okay.
Because, all those guys who were writing about the gods back in the 13th century, like Snorri Sturluson, and possibly, I think the author of Ynglinga Saga is different from Snorri Sturluson. So this guy, for instance, and then, the other texts that are out there, they're treating them as humans. So they didn't see the difference because they were obviously Christian. And they were like, well, these stories are about like sorcerers, not about actual gods.
Okay.
So yeah, it's iffy. But to make it simple, we try to say these we and as modern scholars, we recognize that the stories that Snorri Sturluson put in his prose Edda, they're about gods. So we shouldn't call those sagas. We should call them myths instead.
Okay.
And then you have like one scholar over in the corner being like, well, actually, he uses another word for him. Nah, nah, nah.
Mm,
But yeah, sure. But they were probably used as myths by people in pre-Christian times. And then you have to ask yourself, what is a myth? And usually in scholarship, that is considered a myth is defined as a foundational narrative that has like fundamental meaning to the society and the people who live in it, right?
okay. So does that
So,
mean that? I guess the one that comes to mind for me is the Volsunga Saga.
mhm.
Now Odin appears in that, but that class as a saga. Is that just because he kind of makes a menial appearance rather
Yeah,
than it being particularly about him?
yeah, it is. So again, scholarship is simplifying here. We classify three types, um, but three main ones: the legendary sagas,
Okay.
the the sagas about Icelanders, and the kings sagas, right?
Okay.
And these three classifications are based off of when supposedly in the time frame of the people writing it are they occurring. So Volsunga Saga is an ancient legendary story that the person who's writing it in the 13th century or 14th century would recognize as very distant from their own time frame.
Hmm.
Whereas the sagas that are about the Icelanders, all those people who go to Iceland and take land there, they're considered closer in time.
Okay.
And the King's sagas are also closer in time. They're in the Viking Age and even in the period after the Viking Age. A little bit before the Viking Age, because we always have some prehistory, like for instance, Ynglinga Saga, that's supposedly taking place before the Viking Age.
Okay.
But a story about Sigurd, for instance, the Dragon Slayer,
Yeah.
that is considered like ancient times, like far, far from the now that this writer in the medieval period is
Okay.
sitting in.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
and that's why Odin shows up. That's also why you have transmutation, where they can turn into animals and all of these things.
Hmm.
These authors that are sitting there in the medieval period and are Christian, they, if somebody came up to them and told them that they could do that today, so to speak, in the 13th century, they would be like, burn them on the stake.
Yeah.
So this is like something that is acceptable as happening like in the distant past where everybody was pagan anyway, and
Okay.
it's okay, that's fine, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah. I'm with you.
So that's the same with Ynglinga Saga. The Ynglinga Saga is this story about that distant past where everything gets a little hazy in terms of events.
Hmm.
The authors are recognizing this as well. They know that, oh, this is a period of time that we are not that clear on, and that's also why we have this story beginning with the gods. Um, so that little spiel about this, the way that the world is shaped and all that stuff, that's really important to understanding where the gods come from and why.
Okay.
Because this is all about the mind of the Christian man who's writing this. And remember this, the Christian man who's writing this.
Hmm.
He says that the world is basically a disk separated into three continents. We have Asia over here in the east, and then we have Europe in the northwest, and Africa in the southwest. And then he goes on to tell us that out there in Asia, there are all kinds of weird things happening. There are giants and dragons and uh, supernatural beings of various kinds. And also the gods. They live out there.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's the important thing here. He's setting the tone. He's telling us, okay, so we have all of these like fantastical creatures in Asia. And obviously the gods belong to that because they're heathen, right?
Okay.
This in the Christian worldview, and you might know this from other stories. When you go far out away from Europe, and you travel around in what is now the Pacific or in South America or something like that, you run into all kinds of weird creatures in the old European stories, right? People with dog heads, or people with no heads at all, but with like a mouth in their stomach. Monopeds that use their single giant foot to shield them against the sun, and all that stuff. That's the European imagination of the world, about the world that we don't know. And in the medieval period, all these monsters, they were used to demonstrate God's order. That's what monster actually means. It comes from demonstrate, right? That's where the word is derived from.
Okay.
So they're placed out there in the periphery, far away from quote unquote normal society, where we live as normal Christians, and that's everything is fine and dandy. But then you go out there, and that's where you find freaky shit. And heathens and heathen gods belong to that freaky shit too.
Okay.
So that's what we start with, right? So our good friend tells us that out there in Asia, there's a place called Ausaheimer, the home of the gods. So that means then that the home of the gods is not some kind of celestial abode. It's not some kind of undefined mythological place in the world. It's an actual country that's right over there in Asia.
Yeah, so it's not strictly like another world, like you tend to get it described as the nine worlds. So it's more kind of a real tangible place.
Yeah, this is, so from the descriptions, this is one of the things that I worked on in my research. From the descriptions of this story, of the place in the story, it actually seems like Alzheimer is located somewhere in the Central Asian space. So somewhere between what is now Iran and Mongolia,
Okay.
like that if we can sort of locate it in the map, that's where we're dealing with, like in the general realm of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan, and so on, like this area.
The stands.
The stands, yes. And whether or not our author here had that much grasp of the geography of that area, that's another question. But what you would find in most scholarship is that they would say that, what the author of this story is telling us is pretty much the same thing as Snorri Sturluson is telling us. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, that scholars today accept the idea that it's Snorri Sturluson who has written this saga. I don't, because of this and several other things. They will say that, it's roughly like that Ausaheimer that is being talked about in Ynglinga Saga is the same as when Snorri Sturluson in his prose edda in the prologue says that the gods come from Troy, because that's what he said.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
He says that when Troy fell in the Great War, that's when the gods migrated out of what is now Turkey and came to Scandinavia. But in this story, these guys are actually placed much farther away into Asia. And we know how this works for these people, right? It's concentric circles. So the closer you are to Jerusalem, the more normal things are, because Jerusalem is the center of God's order. So then you have concentric circles from around there that then make things more and more complicated and filled with monsters. And as soon as you come far enough away, remember the story of Utgardaloki, right?
Yeah.
With Thor, he crosses the deep sea and gets to this outer space area, Utgardar. That's the same mind that is creating this story, right? So you're so far out that all of a sudden, you're hallucinating heavily.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm kind of picturing it like chasing the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, almost.
Hmm.
The kind of the monsters are over there in this land, but then when you travel far enough to get to the land, it's almost like, oh well, they're not quite here; they're over there, and it's always like that little bit further in the unknown
Yep.
area.
And we have so many stories from the medieval period about these psychedelic travels, almost like you're shrooming your ass off through Asia in when you're out there exploring. Like the Marco Polo stories often include a lot of funky stuff. We have the story of Mandeville, who goes out and encounters all kinds of crazy shit. And of course, Gulliver's Travels are another example of this, right? Then you get to the land of the giants, the land of the midgets, the land of the this and that, and so on and so on and so on, right?
I mean, some of the stuff in the sagas have to come from psychedelics, have to, and I would love. I wish we knew an expert on psychedelics so we could get them on to speak about this kind of stuff. Because
Ergot, man.
I think it's probably a big part of human history in general, not just kind of Norse mythology or
Mhm.
Viking culture. And I think it's something that's probably been suppressed the more that it's been seen as a bad thing.
Yeah, isn't it called ergot? That particular mushroom or fungus that attacks um, corn, but not
Or
corn,
is that
grain.
the one that they attribute to the Salem witch trials? Is that the right one? Or possibly?
Yeah, that's part of it, yes. And then you have like in the medieval period, you have several scenarios where different the granaries of a village get attacked by this, and then all of a sudden everybody is like totally freaking out.
Yeah.
Same.
Which that's something that could happen. If it gets into the grain and everybody eats it,
Mhm.
I guess it's kind of like everybody's tripping a little bit,
Yeah,
but nobody really understands why.
exactly. Yeah, nobody knows why. So that's of course a great reason to think that you've been hexed by a witch or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so we have now established that the gods that are mentioned in this story, Odin and all of those out there in Alsaheimr, they sort of like belong to that same space of like freaky stuff that basically is here to demonstrate to us that we need to be good Christians because otherwise we end up among those. Basically, that's the medieval mindset here. Okay, what happens next? Well, Odin then like runs around and makes war, and our author here locates this in the time of the Roman generals. So he's back in the Roman Empire period. Maybe even um, uh, sort of nodding a little bit to the migration period with the Goths and all that stuff
Mm-hmm.
migrating to Europe. And then Odin is apparently like one of these warlords of a Germanic tribe, um, or maybe possibly even an Asian tribe, the Huns. I don't know, something like that.
Okay.
Um, and he then brings his armies, the Aesir, to the banks of the Volga River. And here we have this wonderful um, the medieval etymology where it's like, oh, you can just supplant one letter for another letter and then it means something entirely different, but it's the same word, guys. So our author says the gods, or the Aesir, they come to the river Tanais, which back then was called Tanakvisl, which is the same as Vanakvisl. So that's Vanaheima. Boom, there you go. The
Okay.
Vani live there.
Okay. All right.
So this is one of the major sources to this disconnect or this the separation of the Vani and the Aesir. This is the main source that actually gives us most clues to this. This is
Okay.
the source that tells us that Njörður, Freyja, and Freya, they come from the Vanya and were given in exchange for peace. Because our author here tells us that so Odin is waging war against the Vanir, and then they realize they're equally powerful. So they settle a truce where they then exchange hostages.
Okay.
And Mimi and Heinir go to the Vanir, and Njörður and his two children, Freya and Freya, go to the Icy. And then we get the story about how Mimi's head was cut off. This is the source for that story. That Mimi's head was cut off and then sent back to Odin because Heinir was a stupid leader. He kept saying, "Oh, ask Mimi," when they asked him a question, and then the Vanir got pissed off, cut his head off, sent it to Odin, and then Odin embalms it, and then he talks to it.
Okay.
And yeah, and
Of
this,
course.
of course, and this is really interesting because you could go two directions with the idea of Odin talking to a zombie head. In one direction, this has deep roots in European mythology and ritualistics. So making embalmed heads and using them for ornamentation, it was not uncommon to Western Europeans.
Okay. Right.
We know that the Gauls did it in France, and we also know that all kinds of funky stuff happened with the heads of various people's enemies in different parts of Europe. So it's not unlikely that this is actually like a very old phenomenon, like the war god who rides this eight-legged fierce horse. Also, has a head with him. I could see that,
Absolutely. I
right?
mean, it's a different time. Things are looked at differently. So
Yes,
carrying a severed, embalmed head isn't the same as carrying one today.
exactly. No, that's true. That there are different connotations here. There's also another way that we can go with this to interpret this, and that is in the direction of what the medieval author probably did. And so, if this is a true part of Nordic mythology, then it probably has deep, deep ancient roots. But what we see in this story and elsewhere in this period of time in the medieval period is that the learned authors who are reading these stories and writing these stories, they would interpret this as part of a standard representation of wizards in medieval Europe. Wizards who talk to mechanical heads and sort of that eerie stuff where there's some mage who sits in a castle, high castle that's obviously black, on top of a very steep mountain with like birds of prey flying around and lightning, and then they talk to this embalmed head and do all kinds of like alchemy, right? We
Okay.
know that guy from the medieval imagination.
Yeah.
And Odin is interpreted by them in that context too. So
Okay.
whether or not this is an original idea that was part of Odin, that's another question. But it's definitely being interpreted in this context, this particular context, by these authors. And this is where the East then comes in as an important space of imagination for Western Europeans and Christians in Europe, because stories of various kinds of magicians, right? And we know this magician very well from the again from popular culture. He has like a tall pointy hat, right, and a cape with sun and moon and stars on it, right? That guy
Yeah.
that guy is the European imagination of what happens in places like in Iran and Iraq.
Okay.
And it is part of the European idea of Muslims in the medieval period too.
Okay.
So there is an aspect of these Aesir who are moving along through Europe and eventually coming to Scandinavia. An aspect of them that is interpreted by these Christians who are writing these stories along the lines of what they know and understand about Islam. So this is actually really interesting. So, and this is where the author then tells us that Odin had a bunch of warriors, right? And these warriors were mad and fierce as dogs and wolves. And that was a quality that they could use when they went into battle. That's called Berserkir. So there's your origin story of Berserkir. He says that these warriors put their entire faith in Odin and would pray to him in the battlefield and at sea and so on. And Odin had the capacity to blunt their enemies' weapons and a lot of other war magic.
Mm-hmm.
There are 12 high priests, and they have these laws in Alsahammer. And Odin moves with his armies, right? And all of this seems to an extent reflect the European ideas of Salahdin and the Muslims that fervently kicked our asses when we invaded Jerusalem. And established the Crusader kingdom. That was the major European trauma in the late 1100s, and we're dealing with the early 1200s, so not that far from these events, right? So there might actually be some aspects of the descriptions of the Aesir here that are reflecting these Eastern. That's how it appears to the European imagination. These Eastern hordes of people who, in the European Christian interpretation, have misunderstood Christianity. That's how they believe Islam is. It's basically a misunderstanding, or even sort of like intentionally malicious understanding of Christianity that these evil magicians will use to ensnare people. And that's the image of Odin that is being fashioned here. And that tells you everything you need to know about this person's perspective on the pre-Christian religion. What he's basically saying is that it is a erroneous understanding of Christianity, very similar to Islam, actually. Just like it's very similar to Judaism, because that's what Christians in Europe know as religions that they consider similar to theirs, but wrong, right? And so everything is painted with that brush, right? And there it is all just like people who are going against God's order. And so that's what Odin brings to Scandinavia.
Brings the evil.
Well, it's some kind of yeah. So the context for understanding this is that they believe. So we have prophets, right? But there's only one actual prophet, and that is Jesus. All the other prophets are people who are in it for their own gain. That's the Christian interpretation of other prophets. So Muhammad would be one of these prophets that are in it for their own gain. Other Christians that have been considered heretics, those were prophets who were in it for their own gain. So they're all just trying to, like in this, kind of paranoid Christian mindset. They're all just trying to lead people astray and away from God's true order and all that stuff. And we know that to the medieval Christians in Europe, that God's true order was, well, the Pope.
Yeah.
Boom,
Okay.
right? So that's the basis of all of this. And so then we get to where the gods or the Aesir then come to Scandinavia. This is chapter 8 through 11, I think, in Ynglinga Saga.
Okay, so that so far we've just got Odin traveling up through
Yeah.
Europe, I guess, causing mayhem,
Yeah.
leading people astray,
Yeah.
and then he gets to Scandinavia.
Yeah, then he decides to settle there. And then we learn that some of these abodes that we know from the poem Grimmismal in the Poetic Edda, and also mentioned, some of them at least, in Snorri Sturluson's Edda, we learn that they're actually places in Sweden. So Njörður, he builds Noatun somewhere in Sweden, and Odin, on the other hand, he settles in Sigtuna. And this is where something gets really murky. Because Sigtuna is, we know this historically, Sigtuna in Sweden is one of the earliest Christian towns. It was, the history of it is a little iffy, but we know that Knut the Great had coins minted with his face on it in Sigtuna. And he was, so the question is whether or not Knut the Great actually ruled over Sweden. He, conquers England in 1018, and this the stories about him says that he ruled over Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes in the English, but we're not entirely sure what does it mean that he ruled over Swedes. But we do know that there was coins attributed to him minted in Sigtuna. So there might be some old connection to a king that we might not want, didn't really want in Sigtuna. So that might be a historical aspect to this. But what we're seeing is that Odin sets up shop in Sigtuna, and then he dies.
Okay. That was a bit anticlimactic.
Right. No, that's the awkward thing. All of a sudden Odin dies. And
just what, old age, or
yeah. And so this is also part of the story. It tells us that he then declared that before he died, right, just before he croaked, he declared that, well, in order to go with him to Valhalla, you would have to get stabbed by a spear when you're lying there on your deathbed, right?
okay.
Because that's how it goes. So that's what he does to get into the proper Odin heaven, where he's going to be hanging out with all his warriors and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the story tells us that in that time period, most of the Aesir died, and Njörður then takes over. And Njörður, he keeps up the sacrifices and the laws that Odin had set in place as they were back in old Ausaheimer. So
Okay.
so he just sets up a framework of religion and law that reflects whatever was going on in that elusive country in Asia somewhere. And mind you, that's the thing. Asia, Aesir. Again, medieval etymology. It's like, we know this continent is called Asia, and we have these gods called Aesir. I mean, that's not the only word for these gods, by the way. There's plenty of other words for them, and it seems like it's almost a medieval invention to call them Aesir all the time, as we see it in Snorri Sturluson's Edda and so on.
I mean, how much are they actually referred to as gods in the saga, or? Because I guess it appears to me kind of like Odin's just a really good warrior that's followed by people and idolized by people for being, a great warrior, which maybe he appeared godlike to his followers, but was very much just a mortal man who was a particular, a good leader. And with him kind of just dying in it, just just dying in general kind of
Yeah.
makes me think maybe he's not a god, he's just seen as
So
godlike.
so we have this old word, aus, which seems to suggest uh, a spirit or something like that, a high spirit.
Okay.
Um, and this is what the medieval authors in Iceland are aware of, that that word exists and that was used. It is used in Eddic poetry, in some of the oldest Eddic poetry, um, and it is just a word for gods. We also
Does-
have goth, which means which has its origin in probably a word that means that which you call upon. That's probably what God, the goth, which is the same as the word God, modern word God,
Mhm.
comes from. It just means that which is called upon. Um, and
it,
then we have a bunch of other words as well.
it just feels like he doesn't do anything particularly godly.
No, of course.
As in like it's all very much human actions. So
Mhm.
I was just wondering
But that's
as
because
to
these this author wants to represent these gods. He's interpreting these gods as just like evil sorcerers
okay.
who are taking a piss. That's what's happening here. So, uh,
Okay, yeah, I guess I was just kind of looking at it from the side of the, if you had a leader who was extra special, it would be easy to look at them as being a godlike figure in the eyes of those people. Yet they are ultimately just a human.
mhm,
But to the people at the time, you seem like a like a god figure. I can't remember who he was. I think there was an emperor in China who he was really cunning that he didn't let anybody ever see him. I think
mhm,
there was only like a handful of people, of his trusted people, who could ever look at him, and he only ever dealt with people on the outside through a third party. And through doing that, he gained this kind of aura of being above human. He was a god, but he
right.
wasn't. But just
Mhm.
through those actions to other people, the only way they could explain it was by calling him a god.
Yeah, yeah. No, you have a little similar thing happening, I guess. Here, the explanation for why people would believe that he was a god is that he was capable of all these kinds of magic.
Mm-hmm.
There's a chapter that before they set up shop in Sweden, um, that explains the abilities of Odin, and those abilities include uh, sort of like shamanic trance, where his body will lie as if he's dead, and then his spirit will leave and go to other lands, or go into the ground or up into the sky. He can turn into whatever kind of animal. He can sing open rocks and those kinds of things. Like, but this is a typical medieval magic. That's the kind of stuff that the author who's writing this will attribute to a witch,
Okay.
and that's of course part of the whole narrative of people being gullible fools, that they were so impressed by this witchcraft, which is again the same thing as going against God's order, that they thought he was a god, and that's how he could impress people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
this All of this stuff ties into the constant battle that exists in the medieval period between scientific realizations and um, the idea that God has perfectly described what the world is and how the world looks in the Bible. The part of the Bible that we have available to us, because we don't have the entire Bible in the medieval
Mm-hmm.
period. Um, so 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 ultimately, and we know this, for instance, in the 17th century debates about cosmology and astronomy, right? We know Galileo as the greatest example, right? Who was persecuted for his ideas about astronomy. We know it in context of Columbus going to the New World, where we had the debate about whether or not the Earth is flat or round, right? Most people were aware that it was round, but there was a debate about these things. So, and this ties into the ideas of what witchcraft are, and in some cases we do see that very banal standard thing of like people marking something as witchcraft just simply because they don't understand the science and logic behind it, right? That was part of like this whole general skepsis towards scholars and scientists that you also find today. Is really weird how these things have come back like head on. It's like you have flat earthers.
That's what I was going to say.
And religious zealots everywhere, and then boom, you're a scholar. We don't believe in you anymore, and that kind of crap. Like it's almost as if we've like gone,
full circle,
and we're back to the 1200s or whatever. But anyway, so the next thing to happen after Odin has died is that Njörður takes over, right? And then Njörður also dies. Boom, like that. And then we have his two children left, right? Freyr and Freyja. And what the story tells us is that Freyr, he lives in Uppsala, so he moves the seat of power from Sigtuna to Uppsala. And it says very specifically, he created the crown goods, right? So basically the estate that belongs to the king, and I guess whatever funky hat you get with that, some kind of crown. And Freya, on the other hand, now she is the one who keeps up the sacrifices that Odin had instated. But she moves somewhere up in the mountains, I guess, like some farther away. And
sounding more like the crazy cat lady,
right? And there's something to that.
Oh, really?
Well, see, this is like a narrative trick that the author uses here to. God's hand is working behind the scenes here. That's the whole point here. We have these people who transgress and bring all the funky sorcery, right? Then we have God's hand moving the fate of Scandinavia in the right Christian direction. And that comes with first Odin dying. Odin was the bad guy. Then we have the gullible idiot, that's Njörður, who he wasn't as bad as he was just a fool because he believed in Odin's stuff. But then Freyr, he's the one who changes the place, the site of rule, and then he creates the foundation for the kingship, right, in Uppsala. And the best part of all of this is that his sister, right? So basically, his mirror image, just as a female, she's the one who takes the sacrifices and all that stuff that we're not supposed to do in Christianity. And you know what she becomes then? Well, obviously, she becomes like the godmother of all the witches in Scandinavia. So there you go. You have written off all of the paganism, all of this evil sorcery stuff, and just transposed that upon women, right?
Okay.
So it's not in the male line any longer. And
right. Okay.
Yes, this is very sneaky business. So what does Freyr do? Well, he is so lucky because God's hand is steering everything in behind the scenes. He's so lucky that during his reign, there's peace and prosperity, and everything is just fucking awesome. And, and then he dies, and
What's with everybody just dying?
well, that's what humans do, right?
I thought you were meant to go out in the blaze of glory in battle, and
No, that comes later. Because then the next thing that happens, right, is that he is put in the mound at Uppsala. We know that there's a couple mounds there, and they're very, very handsome and impressive because they're pretty big. And the Swedes, since they are kind of gullible idiots too, they believe that the reason that they had peace and prosperity was Freyr. So they keep sacrificing to him in the form of taxes, right? He demanded taxes of his subjects. Now he's dead, so what do? They pour those taxes into the burial mound. So the gold, copper, and silver into like these holes in the mound.
okay.
So that's how you
I feel like this is a really elaborate scheme by a very good con artist.
That is exactly what it is. This is the whole point. But Freyr is not so much to be like you can't really blame him because he didn't intentionally do all of this. It was Odin who intentionally did it. It was Njörður who then believed so fervently in what Odin had told him and how Odin had conned him. And then Freyr sort of like just keeps a watered down version of all of this, and it's just like some kind of almost atheistic king, and that's okay here because then we have sort of a period of time where we can cleanse the land from Odin's funky stuff. What this definitely telling us is that the era of paganism, as the Christians met it when they began their mission in Scandinavia, is actually very short. It's only like a couple hundred years. The next thing that happens is some sort of blissful ignorance, where it's actually God who is making everything happy, or everybody happy, and everything work out. And this is attributed to Freyr because people are superstitious, but it's okay because they're not really doing animal sacrifices. All that stuff is hanging out with Freya up in the mountains. Meanwhile, their kind of sacrifice is the appropriate sacrifice, paying taxes to the king. Boom.
Of course.
Yes.
Because money gets you a long way.
Right. So that's sort of like the end of pagan reign, even with him. Then after that, we just have like a lot of superstition and gullible fools messing around. And this is where the historical part of the story begins.
Okay.
So we have the poem Ynglinga Saga, which was composed by Fjallnir of Queenie back in the 900s. And that is a praise poem to the Ynglinga line, right? The kings who descends from the Ynglinga, which is an old royal line in Sweden and Norway. The reason that poem is in existence is because there was some tendency by certain important Icelanders in the early times, in the 1100s and so on, to associate with that royal line too. They considered themselves descendants. For instance, Ari Fróði, the second historian of Iceland, right, who writes in the 1120s and 30s. He wrote Íslendinga book, and he probably compiled Landnáma book. And in Íslendinga book, he is telling us that he descends from the Ynglinga. Now, the royal line in this early part where we have the gods, according to him, is different. It's not so much Odin. Njörður is involved, and Freya, or Freya at least. But but Odin is not. It's some elusive Turkish king instead, and that's what he's called, Tyrkakonung, Turkish king.
Imaginative.
Mm-hmm. I mean, again, it's the idea of like descending from migrants from Troy, which we also find in the Frankish Empire. We find it in Rome, right? Romulus and Remus come from Troy,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the important thing here. This is a foundation story that has been in existence in Europe for 2,000 years almost. About descent from these legendary peoples from Troy. And this is what the Aesir being weaved into once people become Christian in Scandinavia. But Ari, he believes to descend from these Trojans too, just like Charlemagne did, because that's fancy, you know. And so he puts that in his lineage, and then he has the prehistory of the Norwegian, the Western Norwegian royal dynasty that he also claims to descend from. Other Icelanders at the time also claimed to descend from that royal lineage.
I mean, not much has changed to modern day. I guess everybody wants to descend from somebody, somebody cool.
Yeah, no, it's exactly the same as, you know, Mr. Third generation heritage Norwegian in Wisconsin who says that he descends from Ragnar Lothbrok. You know, the statistical likelihood of that, if Ragnar Lothbrok was an actual person, the statistical likelihood of this person from Wisconsin descending from him is actually pretty high, because that's how statistics work.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like there's a statistical 65% statistical probability that I descend from Harold Bluetooth, because, you know, my genetics are very, very firmly Danish, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And that's pretty much everybody in Denmark who isn't a recent immigrant to the country, right? They're statistically very likely to descend from a guy like Harold Bluetooth or Knut the Great, for that matter.
Okay.
So that's how that works. But yeah, so this is the migrating Icelanders and the descendants of these migrants. They definitely needed to also connect themselves to important families back in the continent, and that's what Ari Frodi is doing. I mean, it's very likely again that he probably was related to these people, but the Icelanders have an interest in keeping these stories alive, and so Ynglinga Saga was composed as a praise poem and as a commemoration of the dynasty of the kings in Vestlandet in Norway, is circulating in Iceland too, and that is the historical basis for the rest of the Ynglinga Saga. This is where we have quotes of a stanza about each of these, 47 different kings that came before Ragnvaldur, who is the last in the line. And it's just one stanza saying a little bit, actually not that expensive, not that detailed, about how the king died. So for the next 40 odd chapters, it's like this guy died this way, that guy died that way, and so on and so on and so on.
Okay.
And the author of the saga is interpreting the stanzas. And this is the mode of history writing in medieval Iceland. The Icelanders, they recognize the historicity of skaldic poetry. They recognize that skaldic poetry, in terms of meter and kenningar and heiti and composition in general, was so tight that you couldn't mess too much with it and still actually retain the meter, right? So you can't just like commute one word for another word. So that means you need to learn the poem. You need to learn it meticulously and as detailed as possible, and then pass it on as detailed as possible. Which means then that the likelihood of the content of a poem like Ynglinga Saga being composed in the 900s and then living for 300 years until it's being written down in Iceland, the likelihood of that poem having changed much is minimal. So
Okay.
that's really important. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of other fuckery going on. And that is, of course, the medieval saga writer who is interpreting the content of these stanzas in the poems. So that's an entirely different story. But yeah, we're being told then this particular king lived and died this particularly embarrassing death. And then this particular king lived and died this particularly embarrassing death, and so on and so on and so on. Let me just pull up the text for 1 second here.
Is there any particular embarrassing deaths that spring to mind?
Yes, absolutely. That's why I'm I'm fighting it. So after Freyr dies, we have Fjallnir. He's the son of Yngvi Freyr, and he, according to the saga, the interpretation of the old stanza in Ynglinga Saga, he seems to have drowned in a vat of mead.
Well, I mean, there's worse ways to go.
I guess so. I mean, he got drunk and then he tripped and fell, and there you go. What else? We have Svektir. Oh yeah, he was lured into a rock by a dwarf and disappeared. Then we have Vanlandi, who was killed by an evil sorcerer who sent a mare to trample him.
Okay.
Yeah, and then like it just goes on from there, and it's really interesting to see how these all these figures they die supernatural deaths, basically, right?
I feel like being trampled by a mare probably was just an accident, and then somebody said, "Oh yeah, but it was probably the witch that did it," rather than it being an actual supernatural act.
It is not impossible that it was actually just somebody who was trampled by a horse. Yeah, but it's attributed to a supernatural occurrence of like this Finnish sorceress.
Yeah, because it's a little bit more cool.
Yeah, right.
You know, it's like you can either fall over and drown in mead, or you can be drowned in mead by the wizards and witches who held you under the water, and it takes away a little bit of the embarrassing nature of it.
I guess you're right.
Because it wasn't your fault that you got trampled by a horse, because somebody else made it happen.
Yeah, of course. No, you're right. You're right. It does make it a little less embarrassing.
If I ever die in an embarrassing way, I hope somebody stems it up to witches.
Right?
It wasn't my fault. It was the witches did it.
No, I agree. I hope the same thing here. We also have Domaldi, who was sacrificed because all of a sudden, some time after things have been going well with Freyr and all that stuff, this is lingering for a bit, and then when Domaldi becomes king, the harvest fails, and that's when the Swedes decide to sacrifice him. So that this has been interpreted as part of the idea of sacred kingship, where the king would be in charge of making sure that we have good harvest and peace and all that stuff. And if the king doesn't, well, then we're going to have to sacrifice him, don't we? That's another way to do French Revolution, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you try hard.
It does, doesn't it? Then we have Domar, who also dies, Digvi, who dies. Like, it's very just like these very short like texts that tell us a little bit about how one descendant after another dies. Um, Somebody gets hanged, somebody gets stabbed, somebody gets burnt inside their hall, and so on and so on and so on. But in this, it's very obvious that this royal lineage is completely manufactured,
Okay.
because we have King Adils as well, and that's Attila the Hun.
Okay.
He shows up in here as well, and I believe he dies because he falls off his horse while he's riding around the temple at Uppsala, to in a ritual, to what is he trying to do? I can't remember exactly. He's trying to divine something or something like that.
It feels like these are almost gap filling exercises that they've had a little bit of space to fill, and they've gone, right, I'm going to make up a bunch of kings and some funny ways that they died,
Mhm.
and that's
No,
that.
yes, that is totally the case. So the part of this poem is that it mentions that Adils dies from witchcraft, and is then, so the witch makes the horse throw him off, and then
Of course it did.
yeah,
Of course
exactly.
it was the witch.
Yeah, it wasn't just him who was a fool, and that is then put in there as like an interpretation where, oh, he's doing this ritual and so on. All of these stories have some kind of meaning to to this relationship between Christianity and paganism, that the author is so focused on. But yeah, you're totally right. We are dealing with gap filling exercises because we have Hroth Kraki as well. He's also involved in all of this, and his death is mentioned in like 3 lines or 5 lines or something like that. And we're talking about a guy who has an extensive saga attached to him. So it's mostly just like mentioning, recounting each and every one of these um, predecessors of the Norwegian kings. And mind you, once we get to Rognvald, son of Olaf, is it Olaf Träter? Yeah, I think so. Or is that the other
It,
one?
it feels like the ultimate name drop. It's
Right.
just like somebody who just wants to throw in as many of these, powerful names as possible to give some validity to it all.
Exactly, and that's the thing. It's once we get to Rognvalder, we are dealing with 40 something generations here. And if you put that into math, my friend, how far back are we?
Okay, yeah,
I mean, we're so
yeah.
we're so far back that it would have been completely impossible for that dynasty to exist that long. You
I
know,
mean, some of those kings seemed quite clumsy, though. They could have only been around a few days.
absolutely, they were kind of stupid in that regard. But to be honest, um, one of the most powerful dynasties in Scandinavia in the Viking Age was Knut the Great's dynasty. And how long did his dynasty manage to really hold power over whatever lands they conquered and came from and all that
Hmm.
stuff? That a very brief period of time. It was 3 generations. 4 generations probably. That's it. And that's usually how it goes in those kinds of societies. Then you have
Yeah.
some kind of switch up, and the royal lineage of the Norwegian kings and the Swedish kings and Danish kings, for that matter, too, is all manufactured. Like this is a propaganda. It's not actually how it worked out. And
Yeah, I feel it's extremely problematic as well that people, like we said before, people want to attach themselves to a name. People want that name in their history, in their lineage, and it just confuses things. And I guess it's also a time where you couldn't really check either.
mm-hmm.
You kind of just have to take people's word for it.
Memory. That's just saying
That's it.
Danish. Exactly.
Yeah.
No, see, that's the thing. So, like, even today, so the Danish queen, she claims descent from Harald Bluetooth, and she is out there somewhere related to Harald Bluetooth. But this is through some cousin in northern Germany,
Yeah.
right? And it's the same with the Norwegian king. The Norwegian king is also somewhat descended from the old Norwegian line, but the only way that he is that is through the Danish royal house. Like,
It sounds good.
yeah,
That's what it is, and it sounds good. So
yeah. So that's these this is a way to. I mean, the idea is that you legitimize your power by saying,
yeah.
I'm pretty much the oldest feet that have been walking on this ground, right? That this is a very common human way of doing things. I mean, we do this all the time. There are certain portions of the English population who consider themselves descended directly from the Anglo-Saxons and Normans, and some will use that in saying that they're the shit, and it's
You mean in their Facebook name?
in their Facebook name, for instance.
The middle name on Facebook is like Tony Ragnar Stevenson or something.
Exactly right.
That's the most common one that I see. And I apologize if there is a Tony Stevenson listening. This isn't aimed at you. That was a completely random name.
And it's the same in any other country, right? You have these people whose identity is very closely tied to the idea of being an ancient family on a piece of land. And of course, this comes from a time back in the day when there was cultural and political currency in claiming to be the oldest family around. This is also part of the foundation of Iceland, right? This is why the Icelanders in the 13th century are writing stories about Icelanders that existed in the 9th and 10th century, so that they could authenticate, I'm like, this is my land because this distant ancestor of mine took it.
It gives an air of legitimacy to it. It's especially if you're going for power, and then you can say, well, I'm the descendant of this great king. It does, it legitimizes them. People kind of perk their ears up, and it happens today. Even if just being the son of a famous person gives people that air. It opens doors. Just being,
yeah.
So it does work.
Yeah, absolutely. But it only works because of our imagination.
Oh, of course, yeah.
that's the interesting thing, is if people were like, yeah, I don't care, then you could be descended from whoever the fuck you wanted to be descended from.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that you are going to act the same as they act.
No,
be as good as they were.
No, and it's a power move, right? Which is also why there are so many people in like an immigrant culture like this one here in America who are interested in associating with like the lineage with Ragnar Lothbrok or something like that. And it's like, it's okay, guys. You can still be pretty cool people without descending from Ragnar Lothbrok.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course you can.
Yeah. And so that's the basis of this saga. It's basically to enumerate the different presumed kings that came before the actual line of kings as it begins afterwards.
Okay.
From after the Ynglinga Saga, where we then begin to get into the sort of like the real sagas, right?
Okay.
Where we get the saga of Halfdan the Black and so on from there.
So it's almost like a precursor of just this is how we got here almost.
Yeah. So this is where you need to really question this dynasty, right? Because Halfdan the Black is also almost a mythological figure. He probably existed, right? He's the father of Harold Finehair. Halfdan the Black probably existed. He's probably a historical figure. He's just as much the father of Harold Finehair as Gorm the Old is the father of Harold Bluetooth. Like we know them very vaguely from historical sources, but they seem to have existed. And then you have the king, who you can very much verify in many ways as the first of the dynasty in Norway, Harald Finehair. He's the verifiably first of the dynasty in Vestlandet, just like Harold Bluetooth is verifiably the first of the dynasty in Denmark. But again, there's a lot of material around it that's iffy.
It's complicated.
It is always complicated.
I feel like we haven't said that in a while, so I wanted to just throw it in.
That's true. But when you start looking into the different descendants after Harald Finehair, once again, it starts looking like the Norwegian king's dynasty is manufactured more than anything else. I'm not so sure about the Danish royal dynasty after Knut the Great. I would presume that it is similarly very manufactured in many ways. We don't have much to go on. We can make genetic analysis of certain skeletons that we can find here and there, but sometimes weird stuff happens. What was it? An investigation of was it one of Willem the Conqueror's ancestors, I think, or was it him himself, where they were genetically investigating and finding out that this is not at all a person from from that time period, and like he's older, the person that was in that sarcophagus in northern France. Those kinds of things happen.
Yeah.
Right? And you're like, wait a minute. We were told that this was that guy.
It is very, very complicated. I mean, I find it hard how you even put all this stuff together, because what if you just got one guy who was just a liar, just wrote a bunch of stuff down, and he was just the L. Ron Hubbard of the Viking Age, or the medieval period, and it was just, this is just what we happened to find or what happened to survive.
Yeah, we got that guy. We got that guy. His name is Saxo Grammaticus. He wrote the history of the Danes. It's all full of bullshit.
That's what I mean. So it's so hard to, I guess, to validate it all as well.
Yeah. No, I mean that's where archaeology has been augmenting a lot of, like, before the science of archaeology was really established and created. All we had was the literature. All these texts that were written back in the medieval period. And then you slowly start figuring out, oh, wait a minute. What they're saying compared to the archaeology that we get, that's not really adding up. And now we have multiple other sciences about the material world that can give us clues and insights, right? Everything from ice core drillings that can measure the CO2 levels and whatever else of different time periods in the ice, to microbiology, to genetics, and so on and so on and so on. This can all help us understand the processes. But just a simple example of this is that the Icelandic sagas, they constantly claim that people leave Norway for Iceland around 870 because they're tired of Harald Finehair taxing them and taking their property, right? That's what the Icelandic sagas say. Now, we have archaeological evidence in Sturlufjörður in eastern Iceland that there was a settlement that was composed of primarily, presumably, people from the Norwegian area in 70 years before that, right? So around the year 800. And aside from that, we have also found that the first thing that happens once Scandinavians show up in Iceland is that the walrus population die out. Wonder why? Well, it's simply because that's what the Scandinavians are probably going there for, just like that's what they were going to Greenland for, the walrus. Because that is like expensive ivory and useful hides and blubber and all of the things, right? So, the literature will say one thing, and then the archaeology will give us another thing, and then other investigations of what happens in the environment and so on will then give us multiple other clues for the actual reasons that people go someplace and settle and whatever else they're doing, right?
We need a time machine.
We definitely need a time machine.
We need a time machine. That's my only answer.
Well, if we get a time machine, I want to be Ted. You can be Bill.
Absolutely. And we can just make podcasts back. We can go back and actually see what happened.
Yeah, I'll just need to get the hair.
Yeah. As long as we can be the younger Bill and Ted and not the old ones.
Yeah, no, I want to be young again. That's
perfect. I mean, let's wrap this up. I know you have class to teach soon.
That's
to do your day job. So yeah, you have to go be an actual proper professor.
A proper professor, yes.
That's it.
Yeah.
No, well, thank you very much. Like I said, I think there's a lot of useful information here, especially at the beginning. Just talking about what a saga is, for me, that kind of cleared a lot of things up.
Yeah, no, it's something that we should talk more about, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So as always, people can find you at your name at Mathias Nordvig on Instagram, the Nordic Mythology channel on YouTube,
and also on Facebook.
Right? And on Facebook. Yeah, and you can find me at Horns of Odin or at Daniel_Farrand. I can't remember what it is now. Daniel_Farrand1. I remember that. Yeah, and obviously the website www.hornsofodin.com. And yeah, I guess if you listen to this, thank you for supporting us on Patreon. It means a lot to us. It's helping us get new equipment and making things better.
Yeah, thank you so much for your support.
Perfect. Thank you.